Hello, I'm Nigel Saunders and welcome to the Bonsai Zone. Summer's almost halfway over now. I've been letting a lot of trees grow for the summer, but now it's time to decide which trees I want to put in our club bonsai show. When you're developing a bonsai tree, they don't always look good all the time. In the summer, I like to let my trees grow wild to gain vigor and strength and then prune them back hard again. So a lot of my trees are in that stage where I'm letting them grow really big, and then I'll prune them back in fall to try and fit them in the plant room. I've got about a month and a half before our club show, so the trees that have been growing just wild on the bench, it's time to prune them back so they'll get a second set of growth before our club show, so they'll look really good. The first tree I'm thinking of is in the greenhouse here, and it's this Ficus benjamina over here. This is the tree that I've been trying to style like a tropical tree, not a pine tree. So we'll get that into the studio and have a look at it. Another tree in the greenhouse is my Ficus microcarpa. It's never been shown. This is the tree that I grew from seed 25 years ago. And I think it's getting close to being, presentable for a show. It'll continue and improve over the years. The last tree in the greenhouse is my Christmas cactus, which is way back in there. So I think we'll dig that out and see how it looks. Outside, I've got my little spruce tree here that we could get looking pretty good for the show. I've got a little tiny jade down here that could look good for the show. Over here I've got my larch tree that I think would look good. Possibly the cedar tree back here. My Austrian pine has been in the show pretty well every year, and it's kind of a traditional Japanese looking bonsai, so I think I'll probably include that in the show also. My African Cope landscape with my African styled sarissa trees is growing well, and that can go in the show. I could put my little tamarisk in the show just to show people what a tree can look like in a year. I've got all the trees together in the studio. We'll work on them one at a time. I'll start with the African landscape. This tree has been let grow since the last video on it, and grow it has. The moss is growing, the sedum's growing, and the tree's growing. My only change is I've added a small cutting back here to look like a tree in the distance. On the main tree, I've tried a lot of different styling ideas to the canopy. I've had it quite rounded, I've had it quite flat, I've separated the branches into foliage pads. So today I've got to decide what I'm going to do with the canopy on the main tree. When styling a tree, it's important for me to have lots of reference pictures of the full-size trees in nature so I can study them and get ideas for detailing my own trees. I've looked at many of the styling options for this tree. Some have a very flat top, some have a very rounded top, some have flat pads in different layers on the tree. Some have a very topiary look, so a very dome-shaped canopy. And others have a dome-shaped canopy, but it's broken up into sort of mounds or clumps. So I think for this time, I'm going to train the tree in a more of a triangular form and keep those mounds as clumps on the branches. I'm just going to use my regular long-handled scissors for the initial shaping, and then we'll go in and detail it. So here I go. I want the top curvature almost flat, but with a slightly rounded look. I'll see how that looks. I'll do a little more trimming from the front. and that's got the basic shape pruned into the tree. Down below I have what's called my dead branch. This is a branch I'm growing to look like deadwood on the tree. So when I show the tree, I remove all the leaves and it looks like a dead stump underneath the tree. So it's growing a little long. It's growing right up into the canopy. So I'm going to prune that off shorter. At the base of the tree here, I have a lot of little suckers growing up from the rootstock. That happens a lot on these sericas. So I want to prune them off flush. I just want to get down there and prune them off. I don't want to grow a clump-styled tree, so we'll get rid of them all. Also at the base of the tree, there's a lot of moss growing up the trunk that I have to get rid of, or it'll discolor the bark. So I'm just picking it off with tweezers, and that'll expose our root base. I've got most of the moss removed now with the tweezers, so the next step is just to spray it with plain rainwater and get a toothbrush and just give the trunk a scrub. This will get any remaining moss off and clean any algae off the trunk so it looks nice and bright. You can see I'm starting to get an exposed root base on this tree, and it's quite rugged looking and nice. I'll give the upper trunk a scrub too. It's getting some algae buildup on it. Any tree that goes in a show should have the trunk nice and clean as you can get it anyway. I did some wiring of this lowest branch here because it was kind of hanging down before, and I wanted it to flow up nicely into the upper canopy. So it's just a wire to position that branch just a little higher. I'm going to leave the wire on for now, but I'll remove it before showtime. The next task is to prune up these smaller trees, so I'm going to also give those a top pruning to give a slightly rounded canopy. These trees are still young in their development, so it'll be a while before they look really nice. And then the back tree. With those trees pruned up, you can see the forced perspective. So the large tree at the front getting smaller, and in the distance is the smallest one. I was telling Hong in our club about planting these sedum bushes, and he said that may not be a good idea, that it spreads rapidly, and you can see how much it's grown since I planted it. So today I'm going to prune these up to look like little bushes. I'm going to start by pruning my curved bush shape into it. So doing a profile pruning. With my curved scissors. All these little sedum cuttings will grow if you plant them. They root really easily. By pruning the bush down low, it should grow in really nicely for the show and look quite natural. It'll be nice and green and won't look like it has just been pruned. So it's important to do these things ahead of the show. I want to make sure I get all the clippings from the sedum out of the planting so they don't root and start spreading. You can see that the moss in front of the Land Rover is getting quite heavy and thick. So my next task will be to prune that moss down. And it won't look so good after the pruning, it won't be as lush and green, but you'll find in the next month and a half that it'll grow back in really nicely. So if we don't prune it now, it'll just get into big thick blobs, which are all right if you're trying to make, bushes out of it. So I'll keep some areas long, we'll keep some tufts of long stuff. But we don't want it one big long blob that obscures the landscape. We don't want it too lush looking either. So I'm trimming back areas flat, keeping little bushes. The smaller you make these little bushes, the more to scale it all looks. I don't want any moss under my sedum here. That's looking better. I finished pruning the moss up, so now you can see it looks like miniature bushes. It's changed the scale of the landscape. It looks more miniature. You can picture yourself walking amongst these bushes here, instead of just having one big blob of moss. I'll use the same techniques to prune the sedum behind the Land Rover down and prune the moss in the area up also. I'm working away at the landscape, progressing back towards the back, pruning up my sedum and my moss into little bushes. That's looking really good. I'm going to try and get some forced perspective with my moss also, so the clumps will be rather large at the front of the landscape, and as they get towards the back, they'll get finer and smaller. I've got all the foreground area cleaned up now and looking miniature, so next I want to prune up the copy or the little hill in the back to make it look like it's in the distance. The moss around the hill is getting really thick and doesn't look like it's in the distance, so I'll need to prune this moss down really tightly to the soil surface. So here I go. Just taking a little bit off at a time and pruning it down nice and tight. This type of work is just part of the regular maintenance you need to do to a landscape. You're always pruning the moss and fixing things. And it can be quite creative. I enjoy doing it. As I work away on this landscape, it really gives me the feeling that I'm really here in Africa. And that's why I named my channel the Bonsai Zone, because that's kind of the mindset you get into, that you're actually here. And when you're pruning, you're looking for little details that improve the miniature look of the landscape. I kind of imagine the size of a person walking around. What would they see? So I'm getting close to finishing pruning the background hill, my copy. And it looks a lot better. You can see all the rocks now. I'm going to prune this back tree. I'm going to give it its first pruning. Just prune the top off to start my little flat top tree back here. I've got my landscape cleaned up, so now it's time to detail the tops of the trees. I've done an even hedge type pruning to the top of the canopy. So the first task, I'm going to separate the different branches to form pads. So I'm going to come in and prune away some space between the different branches of the canopy. To separate this canopy into foliage pads, I'll need to come underneath and find the foliage that's attached to each branch and isolate it. And I want to make a little separation between this foliage pad and the one beside it. Up top you can see my first pad here has a little bit of space around it. My second pad here, I'll also prune a little space around it to separate the pads. So now we can see one pad here and one pad here. I'll separate it here a little more too. So there's two pads formed so far. At the back here, I have another pad that'll prune away a gap between this pad and its neighbors. So now you can see I have one pad here, and a third pad back here now. So I'm going to go over the tree and follow this pruning style for the rest of the tree. My goal is to give the tree a more mature look. There's another pad formed. I finished the pruning up top, so now you can see the separation of all the pads into little tiny bundles of foliage. So the next step will be pruning them for profile. To prune our foliage pads, we need to come down to eye level and prune a slightly rounded profile to each pad. So think of each pad as a little mini canopy on a tree. I finished pruning the top of the tree, so I'm just standing back here now looking at it, and I like it. It's got a more three-dimensional look to the canopy. The tree looks larger to me. Yeah, I think that worked quite well. It broke up that canopy. It's looking more like a miniature tree now. I'm going to do some detail work on the back trees. I want to remove any suckers that are coming up from the base of the tree, so our foliage is all up top in the canopy. Cleaning off some of these low branches. And we'll clean up this tree also. Just making the trees a little more compact. Refining the shape a bit. Getting rid of some of these lower leaves down here. As you're working away at these landscapes, you find more and more details that need fixing. You sort of go in that bonsai zone and start looking at it as a miniature or as a full size, like you're there. And you start to notice little details like that moss is too large. So there's always a constant refinement as you're pruning away at the trees and working on them. And it's really enjoyable work though. So on to the next tree. The next tree I'll be working on is my rugged-trunked larch tree. The new foliage is growing in really well on the larch. You can see the smaller needles now. I may even get a third flush this season. At the base of the tree, I'm getting some nice moss naturally growing on the surface of the soil. So I think by showtime that'll be filled in quite nicely and the tree will look really good. I'm going to be pruning the tips off the vigorous branches today, just to equalize the balance of growth and create more ramification. I'm just coming in and clipping out the tips of the new growth on the more vigorous branches. I am going to pinch some of the bottom needles off just to clean the tree up. These needles on the bottom side aren't very efficient because they don't get a lot of sunlight. So by pruning off these lower needles, it thins out the branches a bit, allows more sunlight to get down, improves the health of the tree. I'm going to prune the old needles out of the apex also to reduce the vigor in the apex and keep the vigor down low. So this will help balance the vigor in the tree, which is especially important on large trees. Your top can get quite thick if you don't keep the vigor balanced in the tree. You'll see a lot of large trees that look good when they start out their life as a bonsai, and as they get older they start to get thicker and thicker up top, so that top has to be cut off and regrown. So the more you can balance the vigor, the better off your tree will be in the long run. That's all the work on the larch tree today. All that remains is giving it a good watering and fertilization. Okay, on to the next tree. The next tree I'm going to work on is my tropical Ficus benjamina, and it has a medium-sized leaf. This tree has a lot of development work to go on it. I want to make the canopy really wide and large, so it's got a lot of growing to do, but I'm going to try and style it the best I can today and maybe put it in the show. I'm going to start by giving the canopy a hedge type pruning to get a nice rounded canopy on top. So here I go. I think that's about it. The base of the tree is getting obscured by moss. You can't see the surface roots anymore, and the moss is getting very thick. So I got to prune that down. I'm going to try the flat scissors, see how that goes. Sort of works. You can see even at this height the moss is still really thick. I'm going to have to take it down quite far. This tree's been in the greenhouse, so the moss grows really quickly in the greenhouse because it's humid. It's not as intense as full sun in the greenhouse, so it Moss really likes those conditions. Humidity, bright but not intense sun, and lots of water and fertilizer. Okay, I think I'm going to switch to my other scissors, my curved ones, and try and get this down even further. This allows me to get in amongst the roots better. I kind of want a ring of having no moss around the base of the tree, and then the moss can grow outside that ring. That kind of mimics the style you'd see in a full-size tree, where there's no grass directly below the tree, but there is in the outer edges. There's no point having nice surface roots if they're covered up with moss. So I think this will take a combination of scissor pruning and pulling and getting my tweezers to clean up this root base. I want to prune my moss away from the lip of the pot, so I come in here and I cut along and then scrape the moss off. This pot is just a plastic training pot, and I'm hoping to find a pot for it that I can just slip pot it. So a pot the same size, so I'll just lift the tree out and put it into the new pot. So it won't disturb the roots or anything, and it'll get a better looking pot on it. So I'll go around all the edges, removing all the moss from the lip of the pot. You can see why you should never leave this work, until a couple of days before a show, because your root base won't blend in with the trunk and your moss won't look very good. So this type of work, I'm doing it a month and a half before the show, getting my moss pruned down, removing all the moss from the trunk, and by showtime all this moss will have greened up and everything will look really nice and natural. I'm going to clean up my trunk with water and a toothbrush, cleaning off all the moss and algae the best I can. Once this dries in the sunlight, the roots will go back to their normal texture and blend in with the trunk. The trunk should also be scrubbed. There's always some algae that grows on it, turns it a little green color. We want it to look as bright as possible. We want our foliage to be green, not necessarily our trunks. I also want to scrub up the edge of my pot, get all the algae and moss off that also. You can take sandpaper to these plastic pots and clean them up really nicely. You can even put a bit of oil on them, mineral oil, and they'll look almost as good as a clay pot. Not quite, but it gets to the point where sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. There's the ficus tree, all cleaned up. Best we can get it. This tree has a lot of development work to go. I still want to crease the canopy. Yeah, a lot of growing to do on this tree, but it'll get there someday. The next tree I'll be working on is my little bird's nest spruce. You may notice that the sedum at the base of the tree has grown really long. So that's my first priority, is to get that pruned down. Again, I'll use my curved scissors and we'll just prune it away, getting it back to looking like a small bush instead of a jungle. Unbelievable how fast this stuff grows when you water and fertilize it well. This sedum seems to spread by runners that lie down on the ground and they drop roots. It doesn't seem to spread too much from the base of it. With the sedum out of the way, I can see some moss at the base of the tree that I want to remove. Don't want moss growing up our trunk. I finished pruning up this side of the tree, and you'll notice I pruned the sedum to echo the shape of the tree. So a slope on this side and a steeper slope on this side. I'm going to try that with the main clump of sedum also, having it on an angle and then a sharper angle this way. We'll see how that looks. So here I go. So we want to echo the slope of the tree. I'm going to try this anyway. There's a final shot of the spruce tree. Yeah, I kind of like the sedum. It'll change probably before the show time, but it gives me some ideas for what to do with it. So on to the next tree. The next tree I'll be working on is my Ficus microcarpa. It was grown from a seed and it's 25 years old. In the last video on this tree, the tree was repotted, it was defoliated up top, the structure was pruned and ready for the growing season. So it's been let to grow for the summer so far, and it's just starting to, really take off now. So if I'm going to put this in the show, I want to prune the top of the canopy, get more ramification, and get it neat and tidy. If I weren't to put it in the show, I would just let it grow this summer until fall, and then I'd prune it back in fall. But because it's going in the show, I want to get the tree looking good. When I repotted this tree, I left the soil a little high, so I'm going to rake some of the surface soil away, and we'll try and get some moss growing at the base of the tree. The root base on this tree reminds me of a tree growing in the tropics. I've got the soil down to a good level now, so I can give it a thorough watering and then apply the moss. I've got a tray of moss here, so I'll start applying it to the surface. This moss is a little thick, but I'll put some thick spots and then I'll keep other areas quite thin. So eventually I want this to look like a rainforest. So we'll see what we can do with it in the upcoming months. This moss has been soaking in water, so it's pretty wet and soppy. You want to make sure the moss is pressed firmly down in the soil, so it's good contact. Otherwise it just dries out on the surface. We already have some natural moss growing on the base here. Eventually I'll have to pick that off. I've got all the moss planted at the base now. It's not very green yet, but I think once some sunshine hits it, it'll all green up. I'll probably plant some sedum also at the base of that to give it more of a rainforest look in future. So I still have to prune the top of the tree, but unfortunately I'm running out of time. It's starting to get a little dark out, so I think we're going to have to continue this series, or this video, in part 2. That's the end of part 1. I'm Nigel Saunders of the Bonsai Zone. We'll see you on part 2.